And so we are recording this seminar and we will post it on the YouTube channel for people to watch it and so that they don't miss. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kim Burnett from the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. Kim is an ecologic economist, if I'm correct in this description, who has published more than 100 papers in her very unique area of expertise. Among other works, she is also interested in coastal water management and SGD, which is the common theme for us. Finally, I have to admit that I had to pull some strings to bring Kim here. If everybody's wondering the common last name, this is Bill's daughter, but this is not the reason I invited her. I think her topic is extremely interesting, and I hope that we all enjoy it. And with that said, Kim, I'm passing it to you.
Thank you, Natasha. Okay, let me get my presentation up. And please let me know if everyone can see it.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for the invitation. This is a very unique opportunity to speak about SGD's role in guiding natural resource management. But just to kind of get started, you know, there's a little bit of history here. I didn't just fall into this field. And, you know, sometimes you look back on your life and you think like, how did I get into this anyway? And I have to say this was back in the 90s, mid 90s. I came home from college for the summer and, you know, I needed to get a job and I thought maybe I could like work at the mall, something comfortable inside and air conditioned. And my dad's like, oh no, I have a grad student who needs help, you know, measuring seaweed in the field. And so why don't you come do this? And so I was like, oh, okay. I don't know about this, but anyway, this is Christine Rakowski. She was a master's student with my dad in the mid 90s. And it ended up being really fun and maybe led me to my current path of studying SGD and the social and economic implications of integrating SGD and groundwater into our natural resource management. And then, you know, 25 years later, we're still kind of looking at this. And actually, it's interesting, I think one of the seminar organizers, Niels Muesdorf, who I've never actually met, but I think he may be on the call. I don't know if he is or not, but with him and Makoto Taniguchi, Henrietta, one of my dad's students, we put together this paper a couple of years ago, just looking at all of the different aspects of SGD. And so it's kind of fun to be here and share some of that work that I've done on this topic over the years. Okay, so my plan was to talk about two different projects that are very recent. The first one, this is the team. This is two of my PhD economics classmates, Pap and Chris. Pap works in Thailand and Chris is here in Hawaii with me. And the first project is really looking at what we call mountain to sea ecological resource management. So thinking about when you connect the forest to the groundwater aquifer to what's offshore. This was recently published last year in Resource and Energy Economics. And so I can send that around if folks are interested afterwards. And so the main goal here is to connect all of these systems and to think about, you know, when you're managing one, what is the influence on the other? And why this is relevant in this seminar is because SGD is really the unifying resource between the upstream and the marine ecosystem of interest. And so we developed this economic framework, and I'm going to show you a lot of graphs, a lot of results. But I think, you know, my main goal for today is just to kind of show you and convince you that SGD is important in thinking about all of these kinds of natural resource management questions, and without accounting for it and proper measurement of it, we have, you know, there's a fear that you're going to mismanage either the upstream or the downstream. And so just to kind of reiterate the importance of submarine groundwater discharge in managing these resources. And then we're going to develop this framework, and then we're going to apply it here in Hawaii on the Big Island, on the Kona coast, or the west side of the Big Island. And so just to give you a kind of quick overview of the model. So what this is a dynamic optimization model. There's several control variables, there's a couple state variables, and then there's this really important ecological constraint. So what we want to do is choose a path of how much we should pump every year for 50 years. If we need to go to desal, that's kind of the backstop resource, which we say in resource economics. But then we're also adding this additional possibility to invest in protecting the forest by fencing it. And the reason that's important is because that can actually preserve some of your groundwater recharge, which then will fill up the aquifer, which then has an influence via SGD to the near shore. What is changing while you're making these decisions? Well, the head level of groundwater, or the stock of groundwater, and also how much you're fencing. What is the total area that you're protecting so that you can have that recharge? And finally, where we bring in the marine side is we're actually just going to put a constraint on how much SGD is needed to go out to keep a certain amount of that marine ecosystem thriving. We could have modeled it as another stock or another state, but it just makes everything a little bit more confusing. And so we just added it as a constraint in this case. Okay, and so we need to model all of these linkages. Again, how does the upstream forest and the cover of the forest change the aquifer? How the aquifer volume changes SGD? And finally, what's the relationship to the near shore? And so a lot of this, you're probably familiar with, if you have a lot of invasive species, if you have a lot of plants or animals, it's going to change the hydrological availability of groundwater, and whether that be through transpiration, fog interception, the change in your native understory when you have different kinds of plants. So the general consensus, at least for this area and in Hawaii, is that the native forest does a better job of holding on to recharge than a lot of these introduced species. And so fencing it is a good investment because it can help us protect against the loss of that recharge. The second linkage we need to think about is how the amount of groundwater is changing depending on how much you're pumping from it. And then also just natural recharge, right? So how much it's raining, how much the forest can stay above that rain, and so how much is actually going in. And so this is the second linkage we need to make, as well as then connecting it to the marine ecosystem. And so what kind of, and recently people have been calling these groundwater dependent ecosystems. We've been thinking about these for a long time, but this is kind of the new word. So these are some examples from Hawaii. So Opaiula is a native shrimp species that's dependent in Kona on this freshwater environment. These damselflies are also ecologically important. And I should say again, it's hard to include these in a lot of economic models directly because something like an endangered damselfly doesn't have a market price. And so how do you account for it? And the way we did that here is just by that constraint, saying, we need a certain amount of SGD to come out in order to protect the marine environment. We're not going to value it in dollars, but we're going to put that constraint to change our decisions about pumping and investment in watershed conservation. And these are some other ancholine pools in Kona. And then this is the bottom right is actually a watercress farm on this island on Oahu, which is another case study that we have. And then we know that those groundwater dependent ecosystems are by definition dependent on groundwater via SGD or springs. And so this is a picture from Craig Glen in the same area showing the thermal infrared where the cold water is fresh is coming out via SGD and is darker blue than the other areas. Okay, so now there's a whole bunch of relationships we need to make. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but just to kind of walk through it to show you how we connect all of the pieces. And so the first thing we need to do is say, how does the amount of groundwater change given natural recharge, so rain, how much is coming out via SGD, but also how much we're extracting or pumping. That's one of our choice variables. And then we also need to think about how good is protecting the watershed at capturing the recharge or protecting the recharge. And so what we do is develop these equations saying, recharge is a function of how much area is fenced, which is a function of investment in fencing. Another just kind of quick way I wanted to show you that we are protecting our watersheds in Hawaii, which is very unique, I think. I just can't not take the opportunity to show this cool video. This is actually flying in Maui, and we actually shoot herbicide. That's Chris. This is our pilot, that's me. So that's another fun thing I get to do as so we actually fly over the watershed and shoot herbicide from planes or helicopters to destroy those plants so that we can target herbicide on the bad guys and protect the forest. So I just really like to show that video because it's fun. And that's another way we protect the forest in Hawaii. Okay, back to the equations. The other things we have to do then are connect the nearshore resource. So in this paper, we used a native algae to kind of represent the marine ecosystem in Hawaii. So the growth of the algae will depend on salinity, and salinity will depend on the amount of SGD coming out. So that's the link that we make, is the forest will change recharge, and then the head level will change salinity, and salinity will change the growth of the algae. And so that's how we connect all of those systems. And then finally, what we want to end up doing in the end is maximize the net benefit of using the water. So, I mean, the reason we're pumping water in the first place is because it's beneficial to the society, the community of interest, right? And so we need all of these economic equations too. What's the demand for water? What's the cost of pumping water? And then if we can't, what's the cost of the backstop? Or in this case, desalination. It's much more expensive per unit, but it's kind of, at some point, you're going to switch away from pumping groundwater to doing something else. And so we take all of those equations and all of those relationships I just sketched out, and I'll just jump straight to the punchline, which is that kind of the key result here is that when you integrate optimal watershed investment, meaning you think directly about how you should be protecting the upland to preserve the water, you're actually able to offset the losses of protecting the marine resource. And so it's a really weird way to say, so let me just walk you through. On the left is the case without watershed investment. So if I just, over 50 years, I chose the groundwater extraction path to maximize benefit, it would be this orange line. It's about 1.6 billion millions of gallons per year over 50 years gets us this net benefit. However, as soon as you put in that constraint to protect the marine resource, your net benefit drops. And why is that? Because you're not allowed to pump as much as you want to, because you're protecting the offshore marine resource. And so your net benefit over time is starting to fall because you're able to pump a lot less as time goes on. And so what watershed investment does for you is it actually, so this is now taking into account the protection of the algae, but because you're actually spending money protecting the recharge, you don't lose that 12 million. So you go, instead of going from 282 million to 271 million, this is present value, it's still not as good as, if you just did whatever you want and you didn't care about the marine resource, you would get 282 million in benefit. Now you still have to pay for the fence, right? So your net benefit is going to fall a bit by about 3 million, but not as much as it would if you didn't do the fencing. And so it's kind of comparing the orange to the blue, you lose about 12 million instead of, protecting the watershed. And, I should also say that there's a lot of other benefits to protecting the watershed besides these monetary benefits that we're quantifying. And so there's biodiversity, there's recreation, there's all these other things. That's not in this optimization. All this is saying is that actually fencing and doing watershed protection can actually increase your net benefit via the recharge. And then I'll just really quickly, because there's so many numbers and so many graphs as economists love to have, all of this is dependent on a lot of parameters, right? Which are very uncertain. So it depends on how expensive the fence is, how much your benefit will be. It depends on, let's see, so how your extraction of groundwater changes will depend on the cost of the fence. So if the fence is cheap, you can extract a lot more than if it's expensive, kind of in the way that you expect. Your optimal extraction will go down as your costs go up. We looked at how these, like the degree of protection matters. And so the more you care about the offshore marine resource, the more you have to fence, right? And so and if you kind of lessen that constraint, you have to fence a lot less because you're not as worried about it. And correspondingly, the groundwater extraction paths are very similar. You can pump a lot less if you have a higher level of protection for the marine resource. Okay, so this is all kind of expected direction that you could imagine. Sorry, let me go back. Too many animations. Okay, then we looked at sensitivity about the recharge function. And so in other words, how good is the forest at actually capturing recharge? That's a huge question. And I mean, there's scientists in Hawaii and around the world that their careers are spent measuring, okay, if you have a native forest versus a native forest, how much different is recharge, runoff, evapotranspiration, all of these things. It's very unknown. So when we present work like this, it's important to recognize that we know that these things are uncertain, but everything is kind of as you expect. So the less recharge a fenced area provides, the more you have to fence, right? Because it's not as efficient as collecting water. If a forest was very good at it, then you don't have to protect as much area. And so all of the sensitivity analysis is kind of what we expect. As demand goes up, also you have to fence more. And as demand goes up, you extract more. So all of those are kind of expected, but kind of good to see for the model. And so just a summary of this first project. So watershed investment, as you can see, can offset losses that would result from otherwise trying to protect a linked resource. Partial fencing is optimal in most cases. You invest more as you care more about the linked marine resource. You invest less if the forest is really good at protecting water. And then optimal investment is higher when you need to provide more water because demand is high. So all of those things are kind of what we expect. Okay, so the second project, this is kind of the Brady Bunch. This is a much bigger crew. And you probably know a lot of these folks. So Henrietta is here on the lower left. We have Celia Smith, who's also very involved in her career is dedicated to studying limu and how these things are related. We have a couple students, Brittany and Veronica. And then the project PI is Leah, who's at UHERO with me. And so the idea here, and this is a very recent paper, this just came out maybe a month or so ago in PLOS One. Hawaii is known for many things, but unfortunately, one of the things we're known for is the highest per capita number of cesspools anywhere in the country. And so we have something like 88,000 of them. They discharge something like 50 million gallons per day of untreated sewage, which, and so half of those 88,000 cesspools are actually on the Big Island. So and a lot of them are on the Kona coast, which is where this paper goes again. And so a few years back, maybe about 5 years ago, the state with all good intentions, came up with a new law that said by 2050, all cesspools will be closed and transformed to some other wastewater management source. So that's fine, but that's really expensive when you're talking about tens of thousands of cesspools. And we don't, so from an economics and management perspective, your first question is like, well, how do you do that? Where do you do that? Do you do all of them? Do you do the high risk ones? What do you change the cesspool to? I mean, everybody needs something to deal with their waste in their home. And so we go back to the same area, the Kona side of the Big Island. And again, lots of maps, lots of information, but just again, wanting to show the importance of SGD and linking these land use management decisions with the coastal marine environment. And so what we end up doing is looking at different scenarios of future development. We look at different ways of upgrading the cesspools. So do you change them to a septic tank, which is better? It reduces nutrient loads of NNP by like 30%. Or do you upgrade to something like ATU, aerobic treatment unit, which gets rid of way more of the nitrogen and phosphorus, but it's a lot more expensive. So there's all these trade-offs that need to be considered. And then where do you do it? Do you do all of them? Do you do some of them? How much does all of this cost? And then what we do is we try to look at how the changes in nutrients will then correspondingly change the marine habitat. And how are those linked again? You guessed it, SGD. Okay, so looking at the connections between the elements, we start with groundwater recharge layer from the USGS. Our student Brittany developed a groundwater model for this area, looking at how groundwater recharge with these different development scenarios would change groundwater nutrient concentrations. And then looking at the different wastewater management scenarios, do we do everything to ATU, which is the highest level of treatment? It's very expensive. Or do we do kind of a targeted approach? And I'll show you a table of all the scenarios soon of, the high risk ones we upgrade completely, the lower risk ones we do a little less treatment for a little cheaper. What if we do nothing? What are the costs? And what does this mean for the nearshore marine environment? Finally. So I won't go through all of these in detail, but basically we had 8 different scenarios. Some upgraded everything. Some only looked at the wastewater treatment plant. So one interesting part of this project that we realized is, the law, Act 125 in Hawaii said all cesspools must be upgraded. It didn't say anything about the wastewater treatment plant, actually. And so the wastewater treatment plant is where all the sewer connections go to be treated, and then there's outfall to the ocean once it's treated to some level. And what we actually found, and you'll be able to see in the results, is that thinking only about cesspool management, in absence of thinking about all the sewer connections that are coming online with future development, is not a good strategy, because actually the wastewater treatment plant upgrade is going to be cheaper in the end than doing all of those 88,000 cesspool upgrades. And so that was an important take-home message from this work, is that don't forget about the wastewater. Sewer sounds good because it diverts everything to one place and gets it away from the spatially distributed coastline effect. But, if you're not treating the wastewater up to a certain standard, you're going to get just concentrated problems rather than diffuse problems. And so table 2 just shows you the different assumptions. And of course, all of these are assumptions, depends on so many things like soil type and where you are, and slope of the land, and all of these different things. But we worked with this wastewater working group to develop all of this, and some of our engineers at the Water Resources Research Center, to kind of come up with the different scenarios and also the assumptions regarding how nutrients are changing. And so with the groundwater model, Brittany was able to simulate different N and P, and I'll show you those in a moment, concentrations for the groundwater. And so of course, kind of the inaction, if you just do the permitted development for the future without changing anything, and this black triangle you see in all the maps, that's the current wastewater treatment plant. And so the darker it is, the more nitrogen concentration. And so of course, doing nothing results in the most. Doing the most, upgrading everything to ATU and also upgrading the wastewater treatment plant gets you the most amount of nitrogen reduction. And then there's a whole bunch of things in between. So if you just upgrade the wastewater treatment plant in panel D, you get, that dark spot in the middle goes away, but you still have this distribution of nitrogen throughout because you didn't do anything to the cesspools. Now, as you kind of move through these other scenarios, and this target, that's a risk target. So we basically looked at, based on these risk scores that had already been done in another paper, the high risk cesspools, and that's like distance to drinking water and other criteria, we're going to upgrade to the higher level ATU, but the lower risk ones, maybe further away from drinking water wells, et cetera, we just upgrade to the septic, which is cheaper, but your nutrient reduction isn't as great. But there's trade-offs, right? And so as you do these things, you get different levels of nutrient concentrations, which are then via SGD, and we use a lot of Henrietta's data in this part to kind of, where are the springs and how do those changes in the groundwater nutrients translate then via the springs to the near shore. And so these maps are showing the red is when you have increases in N, the blue is when you have reductions in N, which of course, again, in panel C, you see the most reduction. In panel B, you see the least reduction and the most increase in nitrogen because, B is not doing anything, C is doing the most, and then D through H are all of these things in between. Okay, very similar patterns for phosphorus for all of the same reasons. Again, simulating the key concentrations via groundwater, distributing that via, it matters about waves and depth and all of these factors, how it gets dispersed into the marine environment. Again, red is the increases in P, blue is the reductions. And then finally, with all of that information, so we have changes in the nutrients in the groundwater, which then correspond to changes offshore. We then look at the corresponding marine habitat impacts. And so the red is where you have potential habitat loss. And we looked at two kinds of coral reef and also turf algae. And so our colleague Jade did this modeling, but basically looking at, given the changes, expected changes in the marine water quality, where we can expect loss of coral reef or an increase or recovery in habitat of coral reef. And it's, again, a very similar pattern. You have the most recovery in panel C, the least in panel B, and then everything else is somewhere in between. Things like, so for panel D, the wastewater treatment upgrade only, when you don't do any of the cesspool upgrades, you have a lot of lost habitat right in the center, right? Because you've only upgraded the wastewater treatment plant and nothing else around it. Whereas if you're doing both the plant upgrade and also targeted cesspool upgrades, then you have more of a distributed impact along the coast. And so, one of the most important pieces of this work is just bringing all of this information to decision makers, because when you just have legislation that says you shall get rid of all 88,000 of your cesspools, there's a lot of questions that managers have about where to start, how to do it, what the cost is, et cetera. And so all of this kind of information just helps bring that to bear. These are just the costs, comparing the costs. So of course, the current situation, there's no cost because you don't do anything. Future permitted just means we do the development with no change, also free. Okay, where it starts getting expensive is that third panel, right? Where we upgrade everything to the highest level. We get like 90% nutrient reduction And we also upgrade the wastewater treatment plant. Over $500 million, probably not going to happen. So then what are some alternatives? What if we only do the wastewater treatment plant? Again, that's actually the cheapest option. And it turns out to be not that bad of an option, just leaving aside all of the cesspool conversions. But then if we want to do the cesspool conversions, do we do it with or without the wastewater treatment plant upgrade? And then what do you get back from that? So how do we kind of think about all of this at the same time? Because there's all of these different dimensions, right? There's all these trade-offs between reduction in nitrogen and reduction in phosphorus, improvement or loss in marine habitat, and then finally cost. And so one way of doing that kind of in an aggregate way is just thinking about like this spider web diagram, right? So A is, what if we do the best we can? So we upgrade everything to ATU, we upgrade the wastewater treatment plant. Okay, so basically the ranking for reducing N, reducing P, and improving the marine habitat is the best out of all of those 7 additional categories. That's the best you can do, but it's the worst in terms of the cost dimension. It's the most expensive, $565 million, that Hawaii definitely doesn't have now, especially after the pandemic. There's no way that's going to happen. You know, on the other hand, what if you do nothing? Then for all other dimensions, nitrogen, phosphorus, and marine habitat, you have a terrible outcome, but it doesn't cost anything, right? So you know that it's going to be somewhere in between. It's going to be B, C, D, E, or F, probably, right? What was interesting, what I mentioned before, is, you know, what's not on the table is only doing the wastewater treatment plant upgrade, which is panel B, is actually in some ways potentially a better option than just upgrading some of the cesspools. And so if you compare like options B and C, you know, you're doing actually ordinally a little bit better in scenario B than C. It's a little bit cheaper, and you know, you're actually getting a little bit more nutrient reduction. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that this completely ignores the spatial aspect, right? This is only saying total nutrients reduced over the management timeframe, which is in this case 30 years. So that's kind of why we did this alongside those marine impact maps, because basically we can just then go to the managers and the decision makers and say, this is a hard question, this is a hard problem, here are some potential, you know, trade-offs to consider when making decisions. The last thing we did, because we were asked to, but again, it's a little bit hard to think about it this way, is a return on investment calculation. So for every million you invest, which scenario gives you the, you know, most bang for your buck, right? And again, the wastewater treatment plant looks really good in terms of NNP, but that's only because you're concentrating the nitrogen reduction right there. As soon as you think about habitat, you need to think spatially, because it matters where you're doing the reduction of nutrients, not just how much. And so then, you know, the green is like the highest return on investment, the red is the worst. So actually, you know, when you think about the spatial implications, you have to think beyond just the wastewater upgrade. Okay, so just in summary, and I hope that I've kind of convinced you that SGD has a very important role in guiding resource management. And so in places that have these SGD influenced habitats, you know, volcanic islands like Hawaii, the groundwater aquifer and the corresponding SGD are really the connection between the upstream and the downstream environments. And so modeling the linkages between all of those units, you know, whether it be the forest and aquifer or the land use and the wastewater systems and the marine ecosystem, it helps kind of clearly illustrate the trade-offs facing decision makers and managers. Failing to account for those connections can lead to suboptimal outcomes, which we saw. And so in summary, proper measurement of SGD is important for coordinated stewardship of linked natural resources. That's all I had. Thank you to all of our supporters and funding sources.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you so much. So guys, the next thing we do is, if you have questions, just unmute yourself and shoot the question right away. Should we start? Anybody? It was complicated subject for scientists who are doing water chemistry. Bill, do you have something to say?
For us.
Yeah.
Sorry
Kim.
to overwhelm you with graphs and equations, but
Yeah, I think I did. Kim, can you hear me? Yeah. In the first project, when you were showing the equations for the model,
yeah,
there was a lot of constants in those equations. And I'm
right.
just wondering where they came from. Are those empirically based equations or what?
Yes. So most of those equations and parameters came from a variety of, we started with Caio Duarte's dissertation, which he did like 20 years ago. He did a lot of measurement on porosity and volume and, how big is this aquifer? How quick does water move through it? And I mean, the reason actually both of these projects were completed in almost the same area is because there's actually been a lot of hydrological work done on the Kona coast for several reasons. I mean, one is that water is scarce there and it is developing quickly. The other is that there's the national park, as you know, with a lot of concern about the GDEs or those groundwater dependent ecosystems like the damselfly and the other, the Opaiula. And so there's actually been surprising amount of hydrological work done there. And so, we kind of keep going back there. And actually, so it was a 5-year National Science Foundation funded grant that covered both of these projects actually. And, there were 2 sites. One was in Hualalai or on the Big Island here, and the other was in Pearl Harbor. And, what we realized is there's just as much research in Kona as Pearl Harbor, and there's a lot less people and a lot kind of less scarcity, but the work is there and the numbers are there. So that's why we've done a lot of it there.
Mm-hmm. And another question, what were you actually doing in that helicopter?
We're shooting.
Getting sick?
We're shooting Myconia, which is an invasive plant. And actually it was from Maui. So that was kind of I was snuck it in because it's a cool video, but it's another way that we control invasive plants in Hawaii. And I wasn't shooting anything. So what they do is it's called herbicide ballistic technology. A faculty member, actually he's at University of Florida now. He used to be at University of Hawaii, but he developed this technology where you put paintball, actually it's herbicide into paintballs, and then you shoot paintballs of herbicide out of these guns from different levels. So like we would circle at 100 meters and 200 meters and 300 meters. And, they're taking, GPS of where we are. So they have these really great flight maps and they kind of understand the biology of like how often they have to go back and control it. And the reason is because Myconia, you can see very clearly from the air. And this way you can really target the herbicide on one plant rather than distributing it throughout the forest and having non-target impact.
Wow,
so
that's great.
Yeah, I don't know anywhere else they do this, and not many economists that have gotten to go. So I'm thankful for that.
Any other questions or comments or thoughts that you had while listening? I actually had something in mind. So the person who did the SGD modeling work, do you know if they did it as a reactive transport or it's passive, in the sense that you're assuming that the entrance of the nutrients, so as the nutrients are traveling with groundwater in the subsurface, they don't change? Do you know any of that?
Where's Henrietta? Is she on this call? I know that, I remember from the discussion in the paper that I think doing it, we had to do it via the springs, basically. Like it couldn't be done only via the groundwater model, because when Brittany tried to do that, the results did not at all match reality.
Mm.
And so the decision was made to instead actually use the springs and the data that Henrietta had to assume something about the discharge rate and the concentrations, and then those things combined with the depth and the wave model that Jade had produced those offshore nutrient.
Yeah, I would assume that for Hawaii would work well because it's a very porous subsurface. You have these large lava tubes, and the residence time of the groundwater in the subsurface is not very long, so it just flushes out. So there's no big chance of like transformation of the nutrients as they traveled. I was just thinking how this could work in areas, in sandy areas or muddy areas where, you know, for example, some of those nutrients will change.
Right.
Okay, so there is a question in the chat, if you can read it. If you, yeah.
If you use DIN, may avoid running into issues with conversion of one form of nitrogen to another, unless there are processes where NO3, for instance, go into N. Oh
Yeah.
boy.
Yeah, Dorina is absolutely right. This is what I was trying to sort of mention here, is those changes specifically for nitrogen, because we see high rates of denitrification in coastal areas in Alabama where, you know, nitrogen, we have pollutions of nitrate from agriculture, but a lot of it just disappears before it reaches the coastline. So some of those issues. But Hawaii is completely different flourishing, groundwater flourishing.
Sorry, I can't say too much about.
Yeah, I assumed. Okay, guys, anybody else has some thoughts about this? I'm hoping everybody's thinking. So yes, very informative talk, because we always justify our proposals with how much coastal communities will gain if we manage better our resources. But I guess somebody needed to put it into numbers and actually show us, demonstrate.
Yeah, that's what we try to do. Try to, you know, come up with trade-offs and numbers that, you know, it's economists, despite how some of them may act, don't have all the answers, right? So we're also just bringing as much information to the table as possible. So I think these means of measuring trade-offs and thinking about the different dimensions of the problem are useful. They're not going to be perfect, right? But at least it gives you orders of magnitude and relative comparisons and to think about how to approach these. These are really complicated problems.
Right. So more questions, guys? You can write them in the chat as well.
I have a quick question. Sorry, I'm not sure how to raise my hand here.
That's okay, just jump in.
Hi, Kim.
Hello.
I'm thinking about the uncertainty in the different dimensions that you have. So there's probably more uncertainty on the marine response than there is on the treatment. And there's probably more uncertainty about that cess to septic than there is about cess to wastewater. So I'm just thinking about how to visually display that information in some of those spider graphs. Like, is there a way to like capture the fact that some of those processes are more understood than others?
Right. Yeah, because you're right that we do, you know, we actually developed, because we worked with like Stuart Coleman and Michael when he was here on the wastewater working group on developing some of those scenarios. We and Roger Babcock, we looked at different like efficiencies of the upgrades, right? So would, you know, how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus would you actually get a reduction of? Because it depends on where you do it, right? Because of soil quality and slope, and I mean, so many variables, right? I mean, Roger was basically like, it can be 10%, it can be 40%, it could be 80%. He's like, but you know, how do you figure this out? And so we did that high and low efficiency to kind of try to take that into account. But on the marine side, we did almost no sensitivity analysis. So that's right. You know, and I mean, part of it is another trade-off is like, how do you account for all of the uncertainties without saying nothing, right? Which is always the common problem. But I would agree that, you know, the next step would be some kind of sensitivity analysis about the marine impacts, because I mean, and when I say impacts, it was really just overlaying like potential recovery and loss zones. And we didn't say how much it would recover, how much you would lose. So it was very kind of a rough, just to kind of try to get that spatial dimension not completely lost in the analysis.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes.
Thanks, Kim.
Great. Do we have more questions?
Stephanie.
Yeah.
Let's see. Notice that you mentioned your study says a lot of background data. Do you have suggestions how we start to explore the economic impact of groundwater and groundwater to provide nutrients in areas where we have less? That's harder because I feel like even with a lot, we have to make a lot of assumptions. You know, I mean, I think having the framework, something like where you're just connecting all of those different systems. So whether it be forest to aquifer to marine, is a good start. I mean, you're going to have some kind of functional relationship in order to do the model, even to do scenarios. And I think, I mean, depending, I don't know where you are exactly, but there's in the resource economics literature, there's a lot of those kinds of papers now thinking about how you connect different systems. And so depending on what kind of environment you're in, I think resource economics provides a good framework. You know, and you do the best you can, and then you do a lot of sensitivity analysis and you use it as discussion rather than the answer to anything. So sorry, that's not the best advice, but it's kind of all I have.
Right. It's been about 50 minutes and I feel Kim is already tired. But if you guys don't have any questions, let's thank her again. We really appreciate your coming and you taking of your time.
Can I ask one favor?
Yes.
Can everybody turn their video on so I can take a picture? Because I don't usually go to seminars with my dad. So it's kind of cool.
Yes.
Take a screenshot.
Yay. I can see faces. Where are you, all of you?
And thanks for those of you who it's late at night or early in the morning. Thanks for coming and not waiting for the YouTube. Okay, on 3, I'll take a picture. 1, 2, 3. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you next time. Thank you, Kim. Appreciate it.